In the spring of 1854, whispers of terror spread quietly through Fayette County, Kentucky. An entire family, 7 people spanning 3 generations of the proud Caldwell lineage, perished within the span of a single month. Their decline was agonizing and eerily uniform. It began with an unbearable irritation of the skin rashes that spread like fire across the body, soon breaking open into raw, festering sores. Fevers followed high enough to drive the strongest among them into fits of delirium until finally, death closed its grip. Doctors were summoned from across the region, respected men from Louisville, even as far as Cincinnati. Yet not a single one could name the illness. It was as though something invisible, something calculated, had moved silently through the Caldwell household. But here is the detail that chilled neighbors and puzzled physicians alike. Each victim, from the eldest matriarch to the youngest child, had been wearing newly tailored garments. And every one of those garments had been cut, stitched, and sewn by the same hands. Those hands belonged to Dinah, a house slave, a seamstress, a woman whose story history tried to bury, but whose quiet, terrible act of resistance still lingers like a ghost in the archives of Kentucky. The local authorities at the time wasted no effort in investigating. The family was buried, the case sealed under silence. Officially, it was dismissed as tragedy, an unfortunate but natural misfortune. Yet, hidden among private letters and diaries unearthed more than a century later, emerges a truth so dark, so methodical, that it was deliberately suppressed. Dinah had orchestrated her revenge, not with blade or fire, but with needle and thread. Before we go further, before we step fully into the halls of the Caldwell plantation and Dinah's shadowy act of defiance, let me pause to bring you, the listener, closer into this story. Because these are not just distant tragedies locked away in dusty pages. They are stories about power, silence, and resistance. And they connect to us more than we often realize. So let me ask you, where are you listening from tonight? Kentucky, perhaps. Maybe the deep south, or somewhere far from the lands where these stories first unfolded. Drop it in the comments. We love hearing where our community of history seekers gathers from. It helps us feel less like we are whispering into the dark and more like we are walking together through the shadows of the past. Now picture the Caldwell plantation as it stood in 1854. 2,300 acres of Kentucky's prized bluegrass country, only 17 miles southeast of Lexington. This was not just farmland, it was an empire carved into the earth. The main house rose like a fortress, a grand Georgian colonial of 6 towering white columns and wide wraparound verandas. From its heights, one could gaze out upon endless fields of tobacco green and golden leaves destined for Louisville markets, where they would command some of the highest prices in the state. The man behind this empire was Samuel Caldwell. He had inherited the estate in 1839, and in the 15 years since he had reshaped it into one of the wealthiest enterprises in central Kentucky. But tobacco was not his only claim to fortune. Beyond those endless rows of plants, Samuel presided over hemp operations that fed the growing demand for rope and bagging all across the Mississippi Valley. He owned a lumber mill that turned his forests into profit. And deep in his warehouses, barrels of bourbon whiskey aged patiently before traveling northward to Chicago or south to New Orleans. By 1854, Samuel Caldwell owned 57 enslaved human beings. And to him, they were not human lives. They were capital living investments to be managed, disciplined, and consumed in the pursuit of profit. Neighbors admired his methodical mind, his sharp eye for returns, but those beneath him knew another truth. His cruelty was as precise as his business sense. Beside him stood his wife, Margaret Henley Caldwell. She had been born into Virginia's tobacco aristocracy. From childhood, she was groomed to rule households and servants with efficiency and detachment. She arrived at her marriage with a dowry that included 12 enslaved people, men and women who had already served her family for generations. Within the walls of the Caldwell home, Margaret reigned with the same iron hand her husband wielded in the fields. She believed enslaved people to be like machinery, valuable, but only if maintained with strict discipline and when necessary punishment. The Caldwell household in 1854 was more than Samuel and Margaret. Living under that vast roof was Samuel's widowed mother, Constance. At 74, frail in body, but sharp in mind, she embodied the old order of Kentucky, the transformation from frontier wilderness to a society cemented by plantations. Constance believed firmly in the absolute authority of white families over their slaves, and though her bones were weakened by age, her authority within the house had not diminished. She took particular pride in overseeing the young enslaved house servants, training them, correcting them, punishing them when necessary. And then there were the children. 3 of them, the promise of the Caldwell name, stretching into another generation. To neighbors and to Kentucky's plantation class, they symbolized the future, a future where wealth and land and human ownership would remain the natural order of things. But beneath that grand vision, in the shadows of the kitchen, in the quiet hum of a needle pulling thread, another future was already being stitched together. The Caldwell children represented 3 distinct paths into the future of Kentucky's planter aristocracy, each one shaped by privilege and cruelty in equal measure. Thomas, the eldest, at just 22, had recently graduated from Transylvania University in Lexington. He was well educated in law and politics, trained to argue Kentucky's interests in the national debate that was tearing America apart. Neighbors saw him as a young man destined for power, a speaker who could one day stand in Congress. But for those forced to live under his authority, Thomas was not remembered for his sharp wit or eloquence. He was remembered for his cruelty. His education had sharpened his mind, yes, but it had also sharpened his appetite for control. He tested theories of discipline on human lives, wielding punishment like a tool. And in the eyes of the enslaved, Thomas was not the promise of Kentucky's future, he was its nightmare. Mary Elizabeth, the only daughter, was 20 years old and celebrated as one of the county's most eligible young women. Her beauty, refinement, and her family's wealth made her the subject of constant gossip in Fayette County. By the spring of 1854, her engagement to Jonathan Pemberton, heir to a vast neighboring plantation along the Kentucky River, was the talk of every parlor. Their union promised to cement an alliance between 2 of the most powerful families in the region. Preparations for her wedding set for June consumed the Caldwell household. Dresses, linens, silverware, and gowns were ordered sewn and embroidered, largely by the hands of enslaved women who would never know the luxury they created. To neighbors, the wedding was destined to be a glittering social event. But to those in the shadows, it was yet another reminder that every flourish of silk, every stitch of lace was bought with their suffering. The youngest son, Samuel Jr., was 17. He did not yet carry the authority of his brother or the social prestige of his sister, but those who knew him could already see the calculating intelligence that defined the Caldwell men. He shadowed his father daily, learning the intricacies of plantation management, crop, rotation soil, chemistry, tobacco curing, and the far subtler arts of control, how to bend dozens of enslaved people to his will, not just with force, but with psychology. Even as a teenager, he studied power not as a privilege, but as a science. And then there was Margaret's sister, Catherine Henley. At 28, she had turned down multiple marriage offers, choosing instead the peculiar independence of living with her sister's family. Free from the burdens of managing an estate herself, Catherine indulged in authority without responsibility. She had a reputation even among the elite for cruelty. Her treatment of house slaves was so harsh that whispered stories about her circulated quietly between kitchens and cabins, warnings passed in the dark. For the enslaved who served within the Caldwell household, Catherine's presence meant not just more work, but more danger. This was the family. Powerful, ambitious, and cruel. Their world revolved around wealth extracted from the labor of 57 enslaved human beings. Every field of tobacco, every barrel of bourbon, every elegant gown displayed at a ball was a product of stolen labor, stolen freedom. Among the enslaved, one woman stood apart. Her name was Dinah. She was 29 years old in 1854. And to the Caldwell women, she was indispensable. Dinah could sew with the precision of a Parisian seamstress. She embroidered gowns so intricately that visitors from Charleston and Richmond praised the Caldwell family's clothing as equal to the fashions of Europe. Her skill was not simply admired, it was envied. Plantation wives across Kentucky quietly wished they had a seamstress like Dinah. But Dinah was not only skilled with needle and thread. She was educated in secret ways her owners could not imagine. Born on the plantation in 1825, she had been trained by her mother Ruth, who had served as head seamstress for the previous generation of Caldwells. Ruth had recognized early that her daughter possessed unusual intelligence. And in the long hours of stolen time, Ruth had done the forbidden. She taught her daughter to read and write. Literacy was illegal for enslaved people in Kentucky. The law feared knowledge more than any weapon. Yet Dinah's secret education flourished. She read fashion magazines, smuggled into the house, studied patterns that would confuse even professional seamstresses, and wrote meticulous notes on fittings and designs. The Caldwells marveled at her efficiency, never realizing that her abilities came from a hidden power they had overlooked: literacy. But Dinah's reading went far beyond fashion. She slipped into the family library when no one was watching. She studied chemistry, botany, medicine, always careful to return each book to its exact place so no suspicion would arise. Over the years, she built an encyclopedic knowledge of plant chemistry that might have astonished university professors. While the Caldwells dismissed her as clever hands with a needle, Dinah was quietly becoming a scientist. Her position in the household was precarious. Too valuable to discard, too intelligent to be trusted. She learned to walk the tightrope of survival, to present herself as skilled, but never ambitious literate, but never curious loyal, but never independent. Every smile, every bow of the head was a mask that protected her life, but crushed her spirit. The winter of 1853 into 1854 pushed her to the breaking point. It was a harsh season, both in weather and in cruelty. Poor tobacco harvests had left Samuel Caldwell desperate to maintain his wealth and reputation. Desperation hardened into rage. Hours grew longer. Rations grew smaller, punishments more severe. House slaves bore the worst of it, trapped within sight of the family every day. For Dinah, the demands were relentless. 18-hour days at her sewing station expected to clothe not just one family, but an entire dynasty. 7 adults each with their own tastes, each demanding perfection. New dresses for Margaret and Mary Elizabeth. Stiffly starched shirts for Thomas and Samuel Jr. Alterations for Catherine, who insisted on new fashions every season. And above all, preparations for Mary Elizabeth's grand June wedding. Every stitch Dinah made bound her deeper into their world of cruelty. But every hour she spent alone with needle fabric and thought also brought her closer to something else, a dangerous idea, one that would transform her skills into a weapon. By the early months of 1854, Dinah's life had become a grinding cycle of exhaustion. Her body breaking under 18-hour days, her mind bruised by the cruelty that surrounded her. But what shattered her entirely was not the work, nor the constant humiliation. It was a single announcement. In February, Samuel Caldwell declared that her 14-year-old daughter Sarah would be sold. Not to another Kentucky plantation, not to neighbors where a mother might still hope for word, but sold south, to strangers, to the deep interior of slavery, where families disappeared forever. Sarah was one of only 3 surviving children from Dinah's 5 pregnancies. She was her light, her reason to endure, her hope that some part of her bloodline might outlive the endless chains. The thought of her daughter being sent into that abyss to settle a gambling debt her son Thomas had racked up during his reckless college years, it was too much to bear. Imagine Dinah in those nights that followed. No sleep, only pacing. Her needle and thread laid neatly at her side, but her mind restless spinning, tearing through ideas, the way a storm tears through branches. What weapon did she have? Not a blade, not a gun. Those belonged to men with power. What she possessed was knowledge, patience, and hands that had created beauty all her life. And in those sleepless nights, the plan came into focus. She would use the very skills that made her valuable, the skills the Caldwells flaunted, to destroy them. Her weapon would be thread, her battlefield fabric, and her victory would be silence. When March arrived, the opportunity unfolded naturally. Margaret Caldwell, always conscious of appearances, demanded an entirely new wardrobe for the spring social season day dresses, riding habits, embroidered shawls, delicate gloves, even traveling attire. These garments would parade the Caldwell wealth before neighbors, before visiting elites, before anyone who might doubt their place at the top of Kentucky society. Dinah met the request with apparent devotion. To the Caldwells, she seemed tireless. Working past midnight by candlelight, her nimble fingers racing over silk taffeta cotton lawn and Brussels lace imported from Charleston and New York. Margaret was pleased her seamstress was producing work worthy of the finest parlors of Richmond or Paris. But what Margaret did not know, what no one suspected, was that those same nimble fingers were now weaving death into every fold. For months, Dinah had been gathering knowledge and ingredients in secret. She scoured the plantation grounds as though on innocent errands, collecting pokeweed roots in the autumn, drying them to concentrate their deadly toxins. She learned the properties of poison sumac that grew wild at the edge of fields. The potency of Jimson weed seeds and the subtle but devastating effects of mushrooms that sprouted in the damp tobacco barns. By dawn, while the house still slept, she tested her methods. She soaked sewing thread in tinctures, oils and extracts, adjusting ratios like a scientist in her hidden laboratory. She stitched test scraps, timed how long the poison lingered, watched how it bound itself to fabric fibers. Some combinations faded in days. Others remained active for weeks. She experimented until her techniques were perfect, potent, yet invisible, subtle enough to escape suspicion. Her method was ingenious in its simplicity. She didn't coat entire garments which might arouse suspicion if symptoms appeared too quickly. Instead, she applied her treated thread only to intimate places: necklines, cuffs, waistbands, seams, those quiet, constant points of contact between fabric and human skin. The toxins would work slowly, invisibly creeping beneath the skin, like whispers in the dark. And so it began. The first test was Margaret herself. Dinah poured weeks of labor into an emerald silk gown, a true masterpiece of 1850s fashion. The fitted bodice hugged Margaret's figure pleats, cascaded down the skirt with mathematical precision, and the bishop sleeves billowed with elegance. It was everything Margaret desired in a dress, a declaration of status, refinement, and superiority. But hidden in its beauty lay the trap. The threads that bound its neckline, cuffs, and waistband were no ordinary threads. They had been soaked in layers of pokeweed extract and poisoned sumac oil, concentrated through cycles of application and drying until their touch was toxic. On March the 12th, Margaret wore the gown proudly to a ladies' luncheon at the home of Judge Harrison Beaumont, one of Lexington's most prominent citizens. The room buzzed with admiration as she entered her emerald dress shimmering in the midday light, her confidence towering. No one could see that every elegant movement pressed the poison deeper into her skin. And Dinah, back in the sewing room, perhaps listening faintly to the distant carriages, waited. The luncheon had gathered the wives' daughters and young debutantes of Fayette County's most influential families, all buzzing with admiration and polite chatter. For Margaret Caldwell, it was the perfect stage to flaunt not only her own elegance, but the extraordinary skill of her seamstress. Compliments poured in, and several ladies even inquired if Dinah could be commissioned for their own wardrobes. Pride swelled within Margaret as she basked in the attention, unaware that every stitch touching her skin carried a silent, invisible threat. 4 hours passed under the polite scrutiny of her peers. The toxic threads pressed constantly against her neck, wrists, and waist, gradually releasing their deadly compounds. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she noticed an unusual itching along the neckline and cuffs, the first warning signs of what Dinah had so carefully orchestrated. She dismissed it at first, blaming the stiffness of the fabric the starch applied with such skill, or perhaps a minor allergic reaction. By morning, the discomfort had escalated. Redness and swelling spread along the affected areas, alarming enough for Margaret to summon Dr. Harrison Beaumont, Judge Beaumont's younger brother, and one of Lexington's most respected physicians. Dr. Beaumont inspected the skin and frowned, perplexed. He prescribed a simple chamomile salve and advised Margaret to avoid wearing the dress until her irritation subsided. He could not have known that these were the early stages of deliberate systematic poisoning, meticulously designed by someone with intimate knowledge of toxicology and human physiology. The toxins Dinah had extracted from pokeweed poison, sumac jimson weed, and toxic mushrooms were engineered to inflict progressive damage. Initially limited to contact areas, the poison slowly penetrated the skin, triggering localized blisters that would eventually compromise the entire system. As days passed, Margaret's condition worsened. Redness turned into painful blisters oozing clear fluid, and the lesions spread beyond the contact points. Fever followed, and new sores appeared in places untouched by the dress, signaling that the toxins were moving through her system. Yet through it all, Dinah maintained her facade of devoted servant. She offered to make Margaret softer cotton garments, carefully tending to the ailing mistress, all while expanding the scope of her quiet vendetta. Other family members inadvertently became her next targets. Samuel Jr. requested new riding clothes for an upcoming hunting expedition with neighboring plantation owners. Dinah prepared his jacket and trousers with threads soaked in an even more concentrated toxin, ensuring that each seam cuff and waistband would deliver maximum effect. Thomas commissioned formal attire for a political rally in Frankfurt, designed to bolster his pro-slavery platform. His coat vest and trousers were stitched with lethal precision, invisible to the naked eye. Mary Elizabeth, oblivious to the growing pattern of illness, pressed forward with wedding plans. Her bridal gown and trousseau became Dinah's most ambitious project yet. Hundreds of yards of treated thread were meticulously applied, every stitch calculated to inflict severe and immediate effects, all while preserving the outward appearance of flawless craftsmanship. By early April, the results were undeniable. 3 members of the Caldwell family now suffered the same mysterious symptoms that had afflicted Margaret. Dr. Beaumont found himself confronting a medical crisis that defied explanation. The pattern was uniform: severe dermatitis progressing into systemic poisoning, but with no signs of contagion. The illness struck only the Caldwells, leaving the rest of the household, including the very slaves who handled and washed their clothing, completely unaffected. Imagine being a doctor in that moment, standing over patients who are deteriorating, watching the redness spread, feeling helpless, knowing that no medicine, no ointment, no advice could halt the invisible agent at work. And all the while, the person responsible moved among them, silently tending the household, performing her duties, undetectable and unassuming. Dinah's vengeance was invisible, surgical, and terrifyingly effective. By April 1854, the mystery surrounding the Caldwell family had reached a terrifying intensity. Every theory Dr. Beaumont had learned in medical school about contagious diseases, epidemics, or infections crumbled before the facts he observed. Each patient had fallen ill only after wearing newly made clothing. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, but how could fabric itself unleash such devastation? Dr. Beaumont scrutinized the garments with meticulous care. They were flawless. Every stitch, every seam, every hem reflected skill, precision, and luxury. High-quality materials, perfect needlework, nothing out of place. To his 1854 trained eyes, there was no evidence of tampering, no reason why these clothes should harm anyone. What he could not detect, what no contemporary methods could reveal, was Dinah's genius. She had devised a delivery system for plant toxins that was invisible to science at the time, binding poisons, to thread in ways undetectable without the sophisticated chemical analysis that wouldn't exist for decades. As April progressed, the family's suffering escalated. Margaret had stabilized, but her skin remained scarred and sensitive. Samuel Jr.'s reaction to his poisoned riding clothes was so severe that he stayed bedridden for weeks, his torso blistered and raw. Thomas's ordeal reached a horrifying public crescendo after wearing his formal attire for a full day at a political rally in Frankfurt. He collapsed mid-speech, clutching at his chest and screaming in agony. Witnesses initially believed he had been attacked with acid. By April 15th, a messenger brought grim news to the plantation. Thomas was not expected to survive. Samuel Caldwell's reaction was immediate, explosive, and predictable. He refused to consider the possibility that the threat might come from within his household. Instead, he blamed external enemies, conspiracies aimed at destroying his family, and the political influence they wielded across Kentucky. He hired private investigators from Louisville, sending them to scrutinize neighbors, business partners, and political associates. Weeks passed as these men traced Samuel's finances, relationships, and even the family's food and water, searching for any hint of foul play. And all the while, Dinah observed calmly. The investigators' focus on outsiders gave her perfect cover. Her unassuming presence and reputation for devotion allowed her to continue her work undetected. She knew that as long as no external threat could be found, suspicion would eventually turn inward. But for now, she was invisible. It was during this window that Dinah made her boldest move yet. She began preparing garments for those family members who had not yet fallen ill, elderly Constance Catherine and Samuel himself. These were the final pieces, the culmination of months of experimentation with dosages, timing, and application techniques. She worked with surgical precision, her mind balancing the roles of dutiful house slave and silent avenger. The psychological strain was immense. She carried the weight of living among those she was systematically destroying while maintaining the perfect mask of loyalty. As the family's paranoia grew, Dr. Beaumont's desperation deepened. He reached out to colleagues across the country, seeking any documented cases that might explain the affliction. Letters preserved in the archives of the American Medical Association reveal a physician at the edge of knowledge, grappling with phenomena beyond conventional science. On April 28th, Dr. Marcus Webb of the University of Louisville Medical School arrived at the Caldwell plantation. He brought primitive toxicology equipment and a methodical approach unknown to Dr. Beaumont. Webb examined tissue samples and fragments of clothing, marking the first scientific attempt to determine the source of the poisonings. Even with his expertise, the limitations of 1854 chemistry constrained his conclusions. Still, his initial findings confirmed what Beaumont had feared. The Caldwells were being poisoned systematically by plant-based toxins applied through their clothing. Organic compounds were detectable in fabric samples, clear evidence of toxicity, but without the advanced tools of later centuries. Neither doctor could identify the exact plants or appreciate the sophistication of Dinah's preparation methods. Imagine the scene: a house once proud and orderly, now filled with fear, sickness, and paranoia. Doctors and investigators scoured every corner, every item, searching for the enemy they could not see. And all along, the architect of this hidden justice moved silently among them, needle in hand, weaving revenge with unmatched intelligence. The arrival of investigators transformed the Caldwell plantation into a pressure cooker of fear and suspicion. Every glance, every whispered conversation carried weight. The enslaved population knew that any hint of wrongdoing could bring devastating consequences not just for the guilty party, but for the entire household. Mass punishments, sales to the brutal Deep South or worse, could follow in an instant. Samuel Caldwell's paranoia had evolved. No longer could he blame distant enemies. The evidence, the precision, the selectivity, the pattern of poisonings pointed inward towards someone within his household. The very method of delivery required access to personal clothing over extended periods, suggesting intimate knowledge of daily routines and a trusted position among the family's possessions. On May 1st, Sheriff Benjamin Hargrove of Fayette County arrived with federal marshals ready to investigate similar poisonings reported in neighboring counties. Their presence escalated the plantation from a medical mystery to a criminal scene, the kind that would eventually expose one of the most sophisticated murder plots in Kentucky's antebellum history. Initially, the investigation focused on external threats, echoing Samuel's own fears. But Deputy James Fletcher, seasoned in criminal investigations, began to notice inconsistencies. The selective nature of the poisonings, the detailed knowledge of clothing preferences, and the sophisticated understanding of toxic plants suggested an insider, someone with long-term access to the household and a deep familiarity with the land's flora. Through all this scrutiny, Dinah maintained her impeccable performance. Calm, composed, devoted, her mask never faltered. She monitored the investigators' every move, planning contingencies in case her methods were uncovered. Yet the strain of her double life was beginning to show, not in ways that the White family could detect, but to other enslaved people who watched with keen eyes. Solomon Wright, a 73-year-old slave who had tended the plantation's medicinal herb garden for over 4 decades, noticed patterns that others missed. His knowledge of plant medicine, his respect among the enslaved community, and his understanding of toxic flora allowed him insights the white investigators could not hope to achieve. He had seen Dinah collecting specific plants over the past year, ostensibly for dyeing fabrics or preparing remedies for the quarters. But the timing, the choices of plants, and the correlation with each family member's illness became impossible to ignore. Solomon faced an impossible moral dilemma. He despised the Caldwells for decades of cruelty, yet revealing Dinah's activities could unleash catastrophic consequences on the entire enslaved community. Kentucky in 1854 was unforgiving. Even suspected revolts could trigger mass executions, and authorities rarely distinguished between the guilty and innocent. He was trapped between silence complicit in further deaths and speaking out, guaranteeing brutal retaliation against innocents. His struggle reflected the cruel calculus slavery imposed on its victims, forcing impossible choices between moral imperatives. Meanwhile, Dinah advanced her final phase with cold precision. She prepared garments for the remaining family members who had not yet fallen victim, Constance Catherine and Samuel himself. For elderly Constance, Dinah crafted a mourning dress with sleeves and a collar treated with a slower-acting but potent combination of toxins. She knew the older woman's body would absorb the poison more readily, ensuring prolonged suffering. Samuel received a vest imbued with Dinah's most lethal preparation. The garment was designed to ensure his death within days. Threads soaked multiple times in concentrated toxins and positioned to maximize skin contact. Catherine's corset was perhaps Dinah's most personal act of vengeance. Years of cruel oversight over house slaves had marked her as a target. The corset's design ensured maximum visible damage, leaving her suffering apparent to all who might observe. Every stitch, every seam was intentional, a silent, deadly message woven in retribution. From the outside, Dinah remained the model servant. Inside, however, the plantation was a ticking time bomb. Every garment a hidden weapon, every stitch a calculated act of justice. By early May, the Caldwell plantation had become a tense, claustrophobic battlefield of suspicion and fear. Dinah's final preparations required her to take ever riskier steps, sneaking into private quarters, moving among wardrobes and storage areas, normally off-limits to enslaved staff. Every movement was calculated, every gesture disguised as the work of a devoted head seamstress. Those who truly knew her, however, began to notice changes. A calmness, almost unnatural, had settled over Dinah, accompanied by a distant, unreadable quality that suggested she had transcended ordinary fears of consequence and survival. Her mother Ruth recognized it instantly. A seasoned observer of generations of enslavement, Ruth understood that her daughter had accepted the inevitability of death and found in that acceptance the courage to execute her plan fully. Dinah was beyond turning back. She was committed, whatever the cost. The tension snapped on May 8th. Mary Elizabeth suffered a severe relapse after wearing what seemed to be one of her old dresses. Dr. Webb's examination confirmed the unthinkable. The poisoner was still active, still had access to the family's belongings. The investigators acted swiftly, and Sheriff Hargrove ordered a full lockdown. No one could leave. Every enslaved individual faced questioning every corner of the mansion searched. As investigators combed through wardrobes, linen closets, and storage areas, the scope of Dinah's operation revealed itself. This was not a random act of malice. It was a systematic, meticulously planned campaign of murder. Hidden garments treated with multiple toxic plants were found strategically placed to ensure maximum suffering for their intended victims. Webb's chemical analysis showed the use of at least 7 different plants combined in ways that amplified each other's potency, knowledge, and ingenuity far beyond the medical science of 1854. Even as the net tightened, Dinah had left one final revelation, waiting hidden notes beneath loose floorboards in her quarters. They displayed an understanding of chemistry and botany that astonished even trained scientists, showing experiments, concentration tests, and toxic delivery methods designed for stealth and efficiency. Each stitch, each seam, each garment reflected her methodical, almost scientific mind at work. Sheriff Hargrove's interrogations initially targeted potential co-conspirators, employing intimidation and threats. Most enslaved people knew nothing of Dinah's deadly enterprise. Her ability to compartmentalize to maintain the appearance of ordinary dutiful service while orchestrating calculated murders was extraordinary. Yet Solomon Wright's long observation of Dinah's plant gathering and knowledge of toxicology made him an essential witness. He had seen patterns others missed, understood the potency of her chosen herbs, and recognized the terrifying logic of her methods. Only when he realized Dinah would likely face execution regardless did he come forward, revealing the full extent of her preparation over a year of meticulous planning. Seasonal collection of toxic plants, systematic experiments disguised as fabric dyeing or medicinal preparation, and precise application to the family's garments. Solomon's testimony exposed a mind years ahead of its time. Dinah's innovations, binding toxins to threads, timing absorption through skin contact, designing garments for prolonged effect, revealed toxicological and botanical knowledge rivaling formally trained scientists. Her understanding of absorption rates, skin permeability, and systemic effects would have been remarkable even for a physician. Yet here she was a house slave invisible to the society around her, wielding intellect and courage as her most lethal weapons. Imagine that every garment a hidden instrument, every stitch a calculated act of vengeance. And while the investigators marveled at her genius, they were also confronting the horrifying reality of justice enacted quietly, methodically from within the walls they assumed were safe. When investigators finally uncovered Dinah's hidden notes, they realized the full scope of her genius and her terrifying intentions. Her writings revealed more than personal hatred for the Caldwell family. Dinah had a political mind, one that understood the broader implications of her actions. She believed that the mysterious, horrifying deaths of a prominent slaveholding family would spread fear and uncertainty throughout Kentucky and beyond, forcing other plantation owners to reconsider their treatment of enslaved people. It's striking to consider Dinah, denied education by law, had studied human nature, social hierarchy, and political leverage. She recognized that small acts of rebellion rarely caused systemic change, but a carefully orchestrated mass poisoning could shake the very foundations of slaveholding society. And beneath this strategic vision lay a personal fury, the sale of her younger brother, the imminent threat to her daughter Sarah, and decades of witnessing cruelty had built a reservoir of rage she channeled with chilling precision. Her psychological transformation was profound. Dinah had evolved from victim to predator, taking the skills and intelligence imposed upon her by oppression and weaponizing them against her oppressors. She maintained the appearance of dutiful servitude while systematically executing her plan, a feat of psychological compartmentalization that even the most experienced investigators found astonishing. On May 10th, Sheriff Hargrove formally arrested Dinah with a mix of caution, respect, and fear. Her composure unnerved seasoned lawmen who had expected desperation or tears. Dinah answered questions with calm, precise reasoning. She neither admitted guilt nor denied the overwhelming evidence. In her responses, she demonstrated a knowledge of legal procedure that, ironically, she had no right to claim as an enslaved person. What was most chilling was her apparent satisfaction with the outcome. When told that 3 family members had already died from her poisoned garments, she displayed no remorse. Her only concern was whether the remaining victims would face the same fate. She had calculated every phase of her campaign timing, each action to maximize the psychological terror on survivors, forcing them to watch loved ones die mysteriously while knowing they might be next. Dinah had made the oppressed feel the powerlessness that enslaved people endured daily. Dr. Webb's continued analysis confirmed that Dinah had prepared enough poison garments to continue her campaign for months, even in the event of her execution. Investigators launched exhaustive searches across the plantation, uncovering caches of treated threads, prepared fabrics, and partially completed garments hidden in barns, root cellars, and abandoned slave cabins. Dinah's meticulous planning included contingencies for any scenario, ensuring her revenge would proceed regardless of discovery. And then came the most disturbing revelation. Dinah's work might not have been unique. Evidence suggested that literate, skilled enslaved people across Kentucky were quietly sharing knowledge of toxic plant preparations, conducting similar acts of resistance without detection. Correspondence found in coded language hinted at a network of hidden rebellion, a subterranean intelligence operating beneath the plantation system itself. Imagine that while the Caldwell family represented the apex of power and control, a quiet, invisible intelligence had been quietly undermining them. Dinah's genius was not just in chemistry or sewing, it was in strategy psychology and foresight. For every stitch she made, there was a plan. For every garment, a calculated strike. And for every death, a lesson in terror for those who believed themselves untouchable. At this point, we have to pause and ask if you were living on that plantation. Could you even imagine the mind behind these acts? Could you have seen the quiet defiance hidden behind skillful sewing and dutiful service? Take a moment. Imagine the tension, the fear and the brilliance. That is the story of Dinah Caldwell, a woman whose intelligence and courage turned oppression into the most chilling form of justice the antebellum South had ever seen. The revelation of Dinah's actions sent shockwaves through Kentucky's slaveholding society. By May 12th, federal marshals from Louisville and Frankfort had arrived at the Caldwell plantation, their presence signaling that the case was no longer a local crime. It was now considered a potential threat to the stability of the entire slaveholding system. National attention turned toward this extraordinary chain of mysterious deaths. Investigators quickly uncovered a chilling pattern over the previous 2 years. Families across Kentucky and southern Ohio had reported similar fatalities. Victims had suffered severe skin reactions, followed by systemic poisoning. And in every instance, the source was recently made clothing sewn by skilled, enslaved seamstresses. Local authorities had failed to see the connections, but the federal agents with a broader perspective now recognized the existence of an organized campaign of resistance. Panic spread among plantation owners. Emergency sessions of the state legislature were convened to address the apparent threat. Marshal William Henderson of Louisville led the expanded investigation, bringing experienced agents who had previously handled conspiracies in other slaveholding states. Their methodical approach revealed the sophisticated intelligence network that had developed among literate enslaved people, capable of sharing knowledge of poisons and resisting oppression with remarkable coordination. Dinah's interrogation intensified, yet she remained as calm and precise as ever. She neither confirmed nor denied the existence of the wider network carefully protecting others while revealing nothing useful to her interrogators. Dr. Webb's analysis of her coded correspondence unveiled a communication system disguised as discussions of traditional medicine and fabric dyeing. Beneath the innocent language lay detailed instructions for creating potent plant-based poisons, the same formulas Dinah had used against the Caldwells. Even federal investigators recognized the intelligence and ingenuity of this network, rivaling any organized resistance they had seen. The broader implications were profound. Enslaved people, legally barred from literacy, had developed a system to share life and death knowledge under the noses of their oppressors. Sheriff Hargrove's questioning of neighboring plantations revealed that awareness of Dinah's methods had spread through the local slave community. Some expressed admiration for her courage, others fear of inevitable retaliation. Across the region, the psychological shock rippled outward, changing how white families perceived the people they had long considered property. Plantation owners, now consumed by paranoia, scrutinized every piece of clothing. Long-trusted enslaved seamstresses were dismissed, and finished garments began to be imported from northern manufacturers to avoid reliance on slave labor for personal attire. Trust, the foundation of the slavery system's efficiency, collapsed into suspicion and fear, disrupting the operations of even the wealthiest plantations. Amid this chaos, Margaret Caldwell, still weakened from her initial poisoning, demanded to witness Dinah's interrogations. Her insistence reflected both a desperate need for revenge and a profound shock at how deeply betrayal had penetrated her household. Here was a young woman accustomed to control and social dominance, forced to confront a truth she had never imagined, that the very person she had relied on to clothe and care for her could orchestrate her near death. And at that moment, in the tense rooms of the Caldwell mansion, with federal marshals observing doctors, analyzing, and an entire community holding its breath, it became clear that Dinah's story was more than a crime. It was a seismic act of resistance that would echo through Kentucky for decades to come. The confrontation between Margaret Caldwell and Dinah on May 13th became one of the most intense and revealing moments of the investigation. Margaret's voice trembled with rage and fear as she demanded answers. "How could you betray us?" she cried. "After all we entrusted to you, all you had access to, all you were allowed to touch." Dinah remained calm, measured, and unnervingly composed. Her response cut to the very heart of the contradictions inherent in the system of slavery. She told Margaret that the Caldwells had never truly provided for her. They had merely allowed her to live in exchange for her labor, a labor they considered absolute property. Every comfort, every garment, every so-called favor had been a tool to extract obedience and maintain control. Her words revealed the profound psychological trauma inflicted by decades of enslavement, yet also demonstrated an extraordinary intellect and strategic mind. She described the long years of watching loved ones sold away, witnessing casual cruelties, and finally the threat to her remaining daughter, a girl only 14 who might be sold to settle her owner's gambling debts. Each injustice had been logged in her mind, catalogued, and transformed into purpose. More chilling was her explanation of the methods she had chosen. The Caldwell family's obsession with fashion and social display had been the perfect tool for murder. Their vanity made them eager to wear the beautiful garments she created, unaware that pride itself would become the instrument of their destruction. Dinah's meticulous attention to clothing construction, choice of fabric, and the placement of poison threads had turned everyday attire into a weapon of precise, calculated terror. As Margaret confronted her, the psychological profile became undeniable. Dinah had transformed from victim to predator, applying intelligence, patience, and cruelty in a campaign her oppressors could never have anticipated. Even her captors recognized her psychological compartmentalization, her ability to recount the systematic murders calmly without remorse with mathematical precision. The arrival of news on May 14th that Thomas Caldwell had died in Frankfurt, poisoned by the formal attire he had worn at a pro-slavery rally, seemed almost ceremonial in Dinah's eyes. Her target had been not just personally cruel, but politically significant. His ambitions to expand slavery into new territories marked him as a central figure. Thomas's death sent a message far beyond the confines of the Caldwell plantation, striking at the very heart of Kentucky's slaveholding elite. Dr. Webb's final toxicological analysis revealed that Dinah's techniques were decades ahead of contemporary science. Methods of concentrating, stabilizing, and binding plant poisons to fabric fibers would not be matched by university-trained chemists until the 1870s. Yet, despite the monumental scope of her knowledge and achievements, the law offered only one sentence. Death by hanging preceded by torture meant both to extract any additional information and to serve as a warning to other enslaved people. Her execution was scheduled for May 20th. Investigators scrambled to gather information about any broader network she might have been part of. Yet Dinah remained resolute silent about others, her mind already prepared for her own end. 2 days before the execution on May 18th, she made an extraordinary request to examine the bodies of her victims. She claimed she could confirm additional targets' knowledge that could potentially save lives if understood correctly. Marshall Henderson initially dismissed the request as a delaying tactic, but Dr. Webb, recognizing the depth of Dinah's knowledge, argued that her scientific understanding of the toxins might prevent future tragedies. The decision to allow her access would ultimately reveal the final, most shocking dimension of her campaign, confirming that the Caldwell family was only a portion of her calculated vengeance and hinting at the broader network of resistance that had been silently thriving across the region. At this point, the investigation teetered between horror and awe. If this story is giving you chills, pause and imagine a single enslaved woman, armed with nothing but skill, intellect, and rage, had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated campaigns of revenge in antebellum America. Hit. Like if you feel the tension and share this story with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. The examination took place in the Caldwell family crypt, a cold stone building tucked among the plantation grounds where the bodies of Thomas, Mary Elizabeth, and Samuel Jr. lay in solemn stillness, awaiting burial. Dinah moved among the corpses with the same calm, methodical precision she had applied to her deadly craft. Her eyes scanning skin tissue and posture with the clinical detachment of a researcher observing the outcomes of an experiment. What she revealed next shattered the investigators' understanding of the scope of her campaign. Each body told a different story of pain calculation and systematic cruelty, a narrative written in poisoned threads rather than words. Thomas's corpse displayed the effects of the most concentrated preparations designed to induce rapid systemic collapse, ensuring death even under immediate medical intervention. Mary Elizabeth's remains exposed toxins deliberately chosen to target reproductive organs, preventing her from producing heirs who might inherit the Caldwell estate. Samuel Jr.'s body bore the marks of a preparation intended to maximize prolonged suffering, forcing a slow, agonizing death that extended his psychological torment to the very end. But it was the revelation about the absent victims that struck the deepest terror into the assembled investigators. Dinah disclosed that her campaign had spread far beyond the immediate Caldwell family, targeting individuals who had participated in the sale and abuse of enslaved people. Judge Harrison Beaumont, older brother of Dr. Beaumont, and a key figure in legal proceedings that had torn families apart, had received a new judicial robe as a gift from the Caldwells 3 months earlier. Sewn with slow-acting toxins, the robe was designed to mimic the effects of age-related illness. By the time messengers were dispatched to Lexington, the judge had already died his passing, attributed to natural causes. Similarly, Jonathan Peyton, heir to a neighboring plantation, and Mary Elizabeth's fiancé had been given several garments by the Caldwell family. Dinah had treated these items with toxins aimed at inducing sterility and eventual death, ensuring that the union of two influential families could produce no new generation of slaveholders. Investigation confirmed that Jonathan had experienced symptoms identical to the Caldwell victims, though he had dismissed them as stress-related. Dr. Webb's analysis of his clothing revealed the same plant toxins applied with careful calculation to produce slow, almost undetectable effects. Most horrifyingly, Dinah revealed that she had prepared treated garments for prominent pro-slavery politicians and businessmen who had visited the plantation for social gatherings and political events. Her reputation as an extraordinary seamstress had granted her access to a network of powerful individuals, allowing her to extend her campaign of political assassination far beyond her immediate owners. The beauty and quality of the garments had made them irresistible, masking the lethal intent woven into every thread. As the investigators absorbed the scope of her operation, a chilling picture emerged. Dinah had leveraged the Caldwell family's vanity, social status, and political connections to create a methodical, multi-layered plan of revenge and disruption. Dr. Webb's continued analysis confirmed that she had developed different formulations for different purposes, some intended for quick, obvious deaths to instill panic among slave-holding families, others designed for gradual decline, disguised as natural illness to silently eliminate targets while preserving the secrecy of her campaign. Her notes revealed that all of these efforts were part of what she referred to as the final phase, a coordinated systemic attack that, if carried out, would have sown chaos throughout Kentucky's slaveholding society, undermining the political and social foundations of a region built on oppression. The full extent of her ingenuity, her patience, and her deliberate cruelty left investigators grappling with the horrifying reality that one enslaved woman had orchestrated a campaign that could have reshaped the very power structures of the state. The timing of Dinah's campaign had been meticulously planned to coincide with the 1854 congressional elections, a period when the deaths of prominent pro-slavery politicians would exert maximum influence on the national debate over the expansion of slavery. The strategic sophistication of her actions revealed that her motivations extended far beyond personal revenge. She sought to disrupt the political and social systems that underpinned slavery, exploiting her knowledge of the connections between individual plantation owners and the broader machinery of pro-slavery power. Sheriff Hargrove's investigations across central Kentucky quickly confirmed that Dinah's campaign had spread well beyond the Caldwell plantation. Reports of mysterious deaths and unexplained illnesses among influential slaveholding families over the previous year bore the same signature patterns: sudden systemic poisoning, linked to freshly made garments. The realization that a coordinated network of literate enslaved people had executed such operations under the noses of white authorities for months or even years sent waves of panic throughout Kentucky's plantation society. Emergency measures followed immediately. Governor Lazarus Powell declared martial law in 5 counties, ordering military units to conduct thorough inspections of plantation estates in search of evidence of organized resistance. Federal investigators were dispatched to neighboring states, uncovering a pattern of deaths that mirrored Dinah's methods, suggesting her knowledge and techniques had spread through a larger regional network of enslaved strategists. The security of the entire slaveholding system was thrown into crisis. White authorities realized for the first time that their control over enslaved populations was more fragile than they had ever imagined. Yet, through the growing panic and nationwide attention, Dinah herself remained undaunted, calm, and resolute. She faced her impending execution with the same meticulous planning and psychological preparation that had guided her lethal campaign. On the evening of May 19th, the night before her scheduled death, she made a final statement that would etch her mind into the history of slave resistance, a statement that chilled investigators and plantation owners alike. On May 20th, 1854, Dinah was executed before a crowd of over 200 plantation owners, government officials, and curious spectators who had traveled from across Kentucky to witness what newspapers would call the most diabolical slave conspiracy in American history. But even her death could not erase the fear and upheaval she had caused. From the gallows, she spoke with the same intelligence, calm, and moral clarity that had defined her entire campaign. Her words addressed the moral contradictions of slavery itself and served as a warning. The methods she had pioneered could inspire others to similar acts of resistance. "You have taught us that human beings can be property," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "You have shown us that families can be separated for profit, that children can be sold like livestock, that human suffering is acceptable when it serves white interests. I have simply used your own lessons to teach you what it feels like to be powerless in the face of systematic cruelty." Reporters and officials recorded her words, creating a document that would be suppressed for decades, but which would later emerge as one of the most articulate statements of slave resistance philosophy ever recorded. Even in her final moments, Dinah displayed intelligence and moral reasoning that challenged every assumption about the capabilities of enslaved people, a reminder that the system of slavery had itself sown the seeds of its own disruption. Her campaign, her intellect, and her final declaration left a legacy that would haunt Kentucky's plantation society for generations, proving that the oppressed, when armed with cunning and knowledge, could strike at the very foundations of power that sought to dominate them. The investigation that followed Dinah's execution revealed the full scope of her network and its profound impact on slaveholding society across the region. Dr. Webb's careful analysis of similar cases in neighboring counties confirmed that at least 12 prominent families had lost members to what appeared to be coordinated poisoning campaigns using methods identical to Dinah's. Federal authorities identified over 30 cases of mysterious deaths among politicians, judges, and plantation owners that shared the same signature toxic plant preparations applied through clothing. The sophistication and coordination of these attacks shattered assumptions about white control over enslaved communities. For the first time, plantation owners understood that trusted house slaves could possess both the knowledge and motivation to kill their owners through intimate access to clothing, creating widespread paranoia. Normal plantation operations became fraught with fear. Enslaved seamstresses were dismissed. Finished garments were imported from the north, and security measures fundamentally altered the relationships between slaveholders and the people they claimed to own. The trust that had allowed slavery to function efficiently gave way to suspicion and dread, making the system less profitable and far more psychologically taxing. Solomon Wright, the elderly enslaved man whose testimony had helped expose Dinah, lived for 3 more years before dying of natural causes in 1857. His position remained morally complex. Some enslaved people viewed him as a traitor who had betrayed a heroic figure, while others understood that he had acted to prevent further deaths among innocent community members. Solomon's impossible choices illustrated the psychological torture slavery imposed on entire communities. The surviving Caldwell family never fully recovered. Samuel Caldwell, though spared from wearing poisoned garments, was traumatized by the systematic murder of his family and sold the plantation in 1856, abandoning Kentucky entirely. Margaret Caldwell lived until 1859, but remained physically scarred and psychologically fragile, bearing the lasting imprint of Dinah's toxins. Her sister Catherine survived, but her exposure left her incapacitated, unable to live independently. Constance Caldwell, the elderly matriarch, died just 2 weeks after Dinah's execution. Whether from delayed poisoning effects or natural causes remained unknown, marking the end of the Caldwell family's role in local plantation society. The plantation itself was eventually divided and sold, the main house abandoned and left to decay. Locals avoided the property haunted by the mysterious deaths, and it earned a reputation that kept it empty for decades. Dr. Webb's scientific documentation of Dinah's methods would later contribute to advances in toxicology, informing medical treatments for poisoning and security measures to prevent similar attacks. Evidence suggested that her correspondence network had spread knowledge of toxic preparations across multiple states, though it was never fully mapped. Even after her death, cases of mysterious deaths among slaveholding families continued, though none matched the systematic precision of Dinah's campaign. The political ramifications of her actions extended far beyond the immediate victims. The revelation that enslaved people could orchestrate such sophisticated operations challenged pervasive assumptions about their supposed intellectual inferiority, while the terror she instilled among plantation families revealed the inherent instability of a system built on oppression. Historians today recognize Dinah's campaign as one of the most sophisticated forms of resistance in American slavery, demonstrating that enslaved people could wield intelligence, patience, and intimate knowledge of their oppressors to strike back in ways that plantation owners could never anticipate. Records of the case were suppressed for over a century, reflecting America's discomfort with acknowledging the reality of organized, intelligent resistance. Only with the civil rights movement did scholars begin to study Dinah as a strategic actor, not merely a criminal. Today, the former Caldwell plantation is marked only by stone foundations, and the family cemetery where Dinah's victims were buried standing as a haunting reminder of her campaign. This story shows that the most dangerous resistance often comes not from open rebellion, but from the quiet determination of individuals who turn the tools and routines of their oppressors into instruments of justice. What do you think? Was everything about Dinah's network and methods truly uncovered? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want more stories uncovering the hidden truths of history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex realities of resistance.